Masechet Yevamot Daf Lamed Gimel. Yesterday we saw two machalokot that have some similarity. The first one was when two brothers married two sisters, and Rabbi Yosef said, in that case, if that one of the brothers would take one of the sisters, then he would be liable on two counts. Masechet Yevamot Daf Lamed Gimel. Yesterday we saw two machalokot that have some similarity and perhaps overlap. The first one is when two brothers marry two sisters. If one of the brothers takes his sister-in-law, so Rabbi Yosef said he's liable on two counts as his brother's wife and his wife's sister. And that would imply that Rabbi Yosef says, Isur hal al Isur, that you can have one prohibition overlap another and be liable to double. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says, no, he is liable only to one. Now, the last opinion we saw there of Rava says, no, even Rabbi Yosef doesn't think Isur Chal al Isur. He just is talking about different levels of Rishut and where they're going to be buried in the same cemetery as where one person, where you're liable to one or liable to two. But we are now going back and to the original proposition where Rabbi Yosef certainly admits that Isur Chal al Isur when it is an Isur Mosif. The question is, what about an Isur Kolel? Again, Isur Mosif is when the object that is prohibited has more people that are prohibited to it, and there, for sure, Isur Chal al Isur. The question that we were left with was, what does Rabbi Yosef think about Isur Kolel, where the subject, the person who is perpetrating, if he has, by the second prohibition coming on, if that includes other things that he is prohibited to, then does that Isur Chal al Isur in that case or not? All right, so we're leaving that open, and that'll be part of the discussion today. Okay, so in any case, in this case, in the first case, we have Rabbi Yosef, who does have two, and Rabbi Shimon has one. Then we saw three cases that we explained in a simple peshat way, where Rabbi Yechiya involves two prohibitions and bar kapara one. Like the first one was a zad, a non-kohen, who performs avodah on Shabbat. Rabbi Yechiya says he's liable on two counts, prohibited melacha on Shabbat, and also that he's a non-kohen. Bar kapara says only one applies, and the peshat of that is about the scope of the exemption, as we mentioned yesterday. But now that we have these two that we learned back to back, let's see if we can try to reconcile them with each other. Rabbi Yechiya and Bar Kapara are Amoraim. Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon are Tanaim. So in a simple way would be to say that it's the same machloket. Rabbi Yechiya follows Rabbi Yosef, Bar Kapara follows Rabbi Shimon. But we'd rather not say that, because we don't want to have to pigeonhole each Amora into only one Tana. And we'd like to mitzamtzem, to limit the number of different machalokot that we have. So now we're going to try, we're going to have three different attempts to try to say what is at the essence of the machlokot between Rabbi Yechiya and Bar Kapara. First, we're going to say maybe they both agree with Rabbi Yosef. And arguing within the Rabbi Yosef, and the question is, what does Rabbi Yosef say about Isur Kolel? And Rabbi Yechiya would say these three cases are Isur Kolel, and he would say yes, Isur Chal Isur, and Bar Kapara would say no, in Isur Kolel only one. But then we're going to reject that and say no, because the third case is actually simultaneous, not one after the other. So maybe they're arguing within Rabbi Yosef, and they're assuming that these cases are simultaneous, and wondering what Rabbi Yosef would say about that, arguing about that. But then we reject that also, and they say no, are they arguing within Rabbi Shimon? What would Rabbi Shimon say about a case where two prohibitions apply simultaneously? All right, that's the general outline of most of the daf. So here we go. B'mai kami palgeh, what is at the essence of the machloket between Rabbi Yechiya and Bar Kapara? B'isur kolel, v'alibad Rabbi Yosef. So first, maybe they are actually arguing on this question of Isur Kolel, a prohibition that includes on the perpetrator more things that he is prohibited to, if that comes second, then it can apply to the first prohibition that already was upon him. And where they're arguing within the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Chia Saba Rabbi Yosef Bisur Kolel Michayev Tarte. According to Rabbi Chia, he thinks that Rabbi Yosef does prohibit Isur Chalal Isur, also in Isur Kolel, right? And that would apply to his case that he talked about of 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and would apply to the 3 cases that Rabbi Chia discussed. Bar Kapara Sabar lo mechayev el hada. Bar Kapara says no, he does not prohibit Isur Chalal Isur and in Isur Kolel, and that's why in the 3 cases that they're discussing, the second prohibition does not apply, and that's why he says only one. Okay, well now let's look at the 3 cases to see if it can fit. Where do we see that there is the concept of Isur Kolel in each of these cases? Bishlama zar meikara share bimlacha v'asur ba'avoda atjala Shabbat migodeka mitesar bimlacha mitesar nami ba'avoda. So regarding the case of a non-Kohen, at first, let's say on Friday, he's permitted to do any melacha. He can go to work, he can plant things, he can do shechita on animals. He's permitted to do all that on Friday. And on Friday, all the time, he's not allowed to come to the Bet HaMikdash to perform avodah. And all of a sudden Shabbat comes, and now he is prohibited to all melacha. So the perpetrator, right, this Zad, is prohibited in more things because of the second prohibition. He cannot do any melacha. So since this is an Isur Kolel, it's more expansive, so now it will in fact apply on top of the prohibition of avodah. And that's why we have, according to the Bichya, we would say Isur Chal al Isur and is Chayav too. And according to Bar Kapara, he would say that even the Rabbi Yosef would admit here, no, only one. Okay, now that's so the first case works. Ba'amum meikara share ba'achila ve'asur ba'avoda. Someone, a Kohen who has a blemish, he is still allowed to eat korbanot. He just can't perform in the Bet HaMikdash. And now, itamele, when he becomes tameh, migo deka mitasar ba'achila, mitasar nami ba'avoda, that Kohen, the perpetrator, is liable on other activities. He no longer can eat a korban. So since this second prohibition includes more things that he cannot do, therefore we do apply Isur Chal al Isur as an Isur Kolel, according to Bar Kapara, explaining Rabbi Yosef. However, the third case of Melika, that happens at the same time, at the very second that the Kohen will do Melika and break the neck of the bird, it at once becomes Kodesh, prohibited to eat as Kodesh, and so the Zad would be liable for eating that. And it also becomes Nevela, because it dies without Shechita. And this is Nevela, and therefore the Zad is also prohibited from eating it because it's Nevela. Both of these prohibitions come at the same time, and therefore we cannot call this Isur Kolel. It's not Isur Chal al Isur Be'isur Kolel, because they happen at the same time. So we can't say that this person, the perpetrator, is prohibited to more things now when it happens simultaneously, and therefore we reject this line of thinking. It's not Isur, they're not arguing about Isur Kolel within Rabbi Yosef, but rather, perhaps all these cases are actually cases of something happening simultaneously, and that's what they're arguing. Okay, let's see how that works. In other words, because the third case is simultaneously, now they're going to interpret the first 2 cases also as having to be simultaneously, and we're still sticking with that they're all following Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Chia Savar Rabbi Yosef be'isur bat achat mechayev tarteh, ubar kapara savar lo mechayev ela hadam. So within Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chia thinks that when isur bat achat, when it happens simultaneously, he is also prohibited with two. In other words, according to the Bioseh, it doesn't matter if it's one after the other or both happen at the same time, as in these three cases. Nevertheless, Isur will hal al Isur, and he's liable to two. But according to Bar Kapara, he would say that when the Bioseh says in his case of two brothers marrying two sisters that they are liable to two, that's only because one came after the other. So then that's fine. But if it happens simultaneously, then there's a logjam, and both cannot enter at the same time, only one after the other. And therefore, even the Rabbi Yosef would admit that when they happen simultaneously, as in these three cases, only one prohibition applies. All right, so let's test this out. Where do we find the simultaneous prohibitions in the first case? Zar sheshimesh b'Shabbat, kegon da'iteh shetesh se'arot b'Shabbat, davya lehu zarut v'Shabbat behadeh hadadeh. So we have a non-Kohen who serves in the Bet HaMikdash on Shabbat. Let's say he was a minor when Shabbat started, and so as a minor, has no prohibition. The minor is not liable to anything. And on Shabbat is when he grows 2 pubic hairs and becomes an adult. And so right at that moment, he is liable for being a non-Kohen serving and for Shabbat, and it happens at the same time. And therefore, even Rabbi Yosef, who says, yes, there's two Isur Chalal Isur, when one comes after the other, that's when there's one, and then the second one is bigger, so it covers it. But here they happen at the same time, and that's why Bar Kapara says only one. Okay. We can also explain this in the same way for the second case, where someone who has a blemish and he becomes tameh. So same thing. He was a minor at the first, and then he grew 2 sarot. He became an adult and became tameh at the same time. So now the prohibition against someone who has a mum. And it was not that he had a mum first and then he became tameh, but rather he had a mum and was tameh, and then he became an adult. And so at the time he's an adult, that both prohibitions apply at the same time. So that's fine. Or another way you can think of this case is that a person was a regular Kohen. He is tahor and he has no mum, but he cut his finger off with a knife that is tameh. And so that the same moment that the knife touched him, he became tameh, and the knife, as it touched him, also cut off his finger. Having no finger is a blemish, and that's another scenario, gruesome but true, that you can have someone become tameh and blemished at the same time. And the third case is the case that the case that got us into this to begin with, that melika, that becomes prohibited as a sacrifice, and nevela at the same time. Okay, so that's how we can have all 3 cases at the same time. You see, we're really pushing all 3 cases. It doesn't seem to be the pshat that this is the case, but we're trying. We want to see if it can work out. All right. Bishlama l'Rabbi Chaya ki atnei l'dideh alibad Rabbi Yosef ki atnei l'Bar Kapara alibad Rabbi Shimon. Now, we're going to have a problem with this interpretation. The problem is, if you remember in the story, both Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara swore that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, their teacher, told them 2 prohibitions or 1 prohibition. And so if both are swearing opposite things, this makes us uncomfortable. We don't want 2 vows that contradict each other. So we'd like to find some way in which we can understand that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi maybe taught Rabbi Chia 2, and he taught Bar Kapara only 1, and he was not contradicting himself. And so both vows could possibly be true, at least in the eyes of the other. All right, so we'd like to try to figure out if we can explain it in that way. So this will work for the Rabbi Chia, because Rabbi Chia could say, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught taught Rabbi Chia, he was teaching within Rabbi Yosef and saying, right, it doesn't matter if it's one after the other or simultaneous, still it will be two. And in Rabbi Chia's mind, he can think that when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught Bar Kapara, he was teaching Bar Kapara according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And so therefore, Rabbi Chia can think that Bar Kapara is not lying when he vows that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught him only one. That's following Rabbi Shimon. Okay, good. Ela lebar kapara Rabbi Chia shakure kamishakere. But within the view of Rabbi Shimon, and because Rabbi Shimon says that I heard this from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi according to Rabbi Yosef. Right, that even Rabbi Yosef, who usually says two, will say only one prohibition applies when it's simultaneously. If so, then there's no way that Rabbi could have taught Rabbi Chia two, because, right, Rabbi Shimon, all the more so, it says only one in every case. And according to Bar Kapara, even Rabbi Yosef, who usually says two, says only one when they're simultaneously. So there is no opinion that would apply two prohibitions when it's simultaneously. And so, in the eyes of Bar Kapara, Rabbi Chia must be making a false vow. And we don't want to say that. So now we propose a third interpretation, and this brings us here. Now we're arguing within the Rabbi Shimon, although we're sticking with the simultaneous assumption that all three cases are simultaneous. That's simultaneously. Rabbi Shimon, and maybe it's with the Rabbi Shimon. Okay. Bishlama Rabbi Chia ka mishtabal apuke Rabbi Shimon mechazke. So now let's just look at the vows. Why would they make a vow? In the first place, Rabbi Chia would make a vow because he needs to extract Rabbi Shimon from his chazakah. What would normally think Rabbi Shimon says. Rabbi Shimon, in the case of brothers and sisters, says only one prohibition. And so now, Rabbi Chia is making a vow so that you'll say, I know Rabbi Shimon says only one prohibition, but that's where it comes one after the other. If it's simultaneous, then even Rabbi Shimon would agree, two prohibitions. Okay, this is the opposite argument that we just said before. Before we had a bottleneck argument, right? One after the other can apply, but two at the same time can't fit. But now I'm going to say the opposite. This might be the turnstile analogy, right? A turnstile, if you squeeze two people into the turnstile at the same time, they both can get through. But if it's one after the other, once the first one goes, the turnstile locks, and then you can't get through. And so in the mind of Rabbi Chia, he could say, listen, I need to swear because I want to tell you, Rabbi Shimon, who usually says one, that's only if it's one after the other. But if it's simultaneously, I swear I heard from Rabbi that both can get in, and you have two prohibitions. So that's why he had to swear. Ela bar kapara lama le'ishtabo'eh kashya. But according to bar kapara, Rabbi Shimon says, in a regular case of one after the other, only one prohibition applies. So same thing with simultaneous, only one prohibition applies. It's just the chazakah. That's the normal thing we would say. He doesn't have to jump up and swear as if there's some chidush here. And so that is a challenge that we don't answer. And then we have the second challenge, which is parallel to the challenge we had before within Rabbi Yosef. And we say, Bishlama lebar kapara, ki atniyeh leRabbi ledideh, alibad Rabbi Shimon, ki atniyeh leRabbi Chia, alibad Rabbi Yosef. According to Bar Kapara, he in his mind, no one is swearing falsely, because he could reason. When Rabbi taught by himself, Bar Kapara, he was teaching within the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And then, when he hears Rabbi Chia swear that Rabbi taught him too, he can assume, Rabbi must have been teaching Rabbi Chia within the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who in the regular case says two, and here also will say two. And that way, he's not coming and swearing against a mutually contradictory vow. But in the eyes of Rabbi Chia, if according to him, Rabbi Shimon says two, in the case of simultaneous, and that's what Rabbi taught him, then there's no way that Rabbi could have taught Bar Kapara one. for sure not within the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who usually says two, and not within the opinion of Rabbi Shimon either, because Rabbi Chia just said that Rabbi taught me, according to Rabbi Shimon, that there's two prohibitions when it's simultaneous. And then we would have a problem that Rabbi Chia thinks Bar Kapara is making a false vow, and that's uncomfortable. I mean, it's always possible, but we don't want to interpret it in that way. Okay, but we have an answer to this one. Amalach Rabbi Chia. The following is going to be he's going to explain a misunderstanding. So Rabbi Chia could say that it's true. The Bar Kapara did make a false vow, but not on purpose. He just had made a misunderstanding, and so it's not a prohibited vow if he thought he was telling the truth, and it's just based on a misunderstanding. What's the misunderstanding? Ki atniyeh Rabbi ledideh tarte liftor atniyeh. He said when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi taught Bar Kapara, actually he only taught him regarding the first two cases. And he was assuming that one happened after the other, not simultaneously, like is the Peshat of those first two cases. And so he told him, he taught him within the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, one after the other. Isur is not Chalal Isur, there's only one. V'adibad Rabbi Shimon. And then, so that's all Rabbi taught him, only two cases. And then Bar Kapara saw the third case in a different context and said, oh, look at this, about Milika, and it seems like a similar case. So he assumed that they're all the same. He mixed them together with the first two cases, and then he analyzed the same analysis that we had above, and saw that the third case is not one after the other, but simultaneously. And so he said, I guess all cases are simultaneous. If the third case is simultaneous, then the first two cases also have to be simultaneous. And since one of those cases, Rabbi Shimon says, Patur, so meaning only one prohibition. So in all the cases, Rabbi Shimon must say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi must have thought that according to Rabbi Shimon, one is liable only to one on one account in all three cases, and that's why he swore even in the third case and said, "Oh, yeah, Rabbi must have taught me this." But in fact, Rabbi only taught him within the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, when they are not simultaneously, that one is liable only to one count only in the first two cases, and did not say so in the third case. And so we can forgive Bar Kapara for swearing, and for swearing that Rabbi taught him this in all three cases. In fact, he only taught him in the first two cases, and that's how the confusion arose. So if you're feeling confused about this, right, you shouldn't feel bad. Even Bar Kapara was confused about these cases and made a vow regarding it, but he can be forgiven, so we can be forgiven as well. We now have a good understanding to reconcile the original machloket between Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon regarding two brothers and two sisters with the three cases of Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara. All this seems to have been an exercise in order to prepare us for explaining the next baraita. The next baraita is going to refer to only the first two of the three cases, but it's going to present it not as a machloket between the Amoraim, Rabbi Chia and Bar Kapara, but rather as a machloket between Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon. And this seems to be why we had to go through this exercise in order to see how these two sets of cases fit with each other. So here we go. Metibe, a challenge from a baraita. Zar sheshimesh b'Shabbat, u'ba'amum sheshimesh b'Tumah. The first two cases, a non-Kohen that does avodah on Shabbat, or a Kohen who has a blemish and is also tameh. Yesh kan mishum zarut v'yesh u'mishum Shabbat, u'mishum ba'amum u'mishum Tumah. In the first case, he is both a non-Kohen and he violates Shabbat. In the second case, this Kohen has a blemish and he's also liable because he's tameh. Dibre Rabbi Yosef, so according to Rabbi Yosef, in both of these cases, one is liable on 2 counts. Rabbi Shimon omer, en kan ela mishum zarut uba'amun bilbad, ve'ilu milika shayra. And Rabbi Shimon says, no, in these 2 cases, the first case, one is liable only because he is a non-Kohen, and in the second case, only because he has a blemish. And the second prohibition does not apply to them. That's the end of the Braita. Now, this is strange. The third case of Milika is not mentioned here. Why not? Why did this Tana not talk about that case as well? Leman Shayira, for whom did the Tana leave it out? Meaning, which Tana would not agree with that case, that it would be 2 or 1, 2 for Rabbi Yosef, 1 for Rabbi Shimon. If he left it out because Rabbi Yosef is the one that would disagree with it, but that's not true. Hashtad Rabbi Yosef bisur kolel mechayev shetayim bisur batachat meba'iyah. If according to Rabbi Yosef, one prohibition after the other, where the second one is more expansive than the first, and he says two counts of liability there, then all the more so when they are simultaneously, assuming the turnstile model, right? That if 2 go in together, then for sure they can get through, and therefore the Milika case should have been included, and you should have said yes to liable to 2 here as well. Elalav the Rabbi Shimon. Rather, it must be that the Tana left out this case because Rabbi Shimon would not agree that it's only 1 in that case. Ubisur kolel hu b'tepata. Rabbi Shimon only said 1 prohibition applies when there is 1 prohibition after the other. Even if it's Isur Kolel, it's more expansive, doesn't matter. The second one does not apply. And that's why in these 2 cases, he says only 1 count. But if they came simultaneously, like in Milika, then he would have said 2. And that's why he left this out. And therefore, tiyufta, the bar kapara tiyufta. And we can see from here that bar kapara, who we explained right above, that he was giving his opinion within the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. He was saying Rabbi Shimon would agree that if it's simultaneous. We see that that's not true because this baraita includes Rabbi Shimon himself and leaves out the third case, and that implies that Rabbi Shimon would not agree that in the third case is only 1. He would say in the third case is liable to 2 counts. Bar kapara, who in the opinion of Rabbi Shimon said only 1 count, goes against that, and therefore bar kapara is refuted. All right, and now we get to a question of Zar Sheshimesh B'Shabbat B'mai, when we talk about a problem of a non-Kohen serving in the Bet HaMikdash. So a non-Kohen who does anything that a Kohen has to do, that would be liable as a non-Kohen doing avodah. But now the question is, you said that according to the Bioseh, right, he's liable on 2 counts, 1 for Shabbat. What avodah is permitted to a Kohen on Shabbat that would be prohibited to a Zad and would be a violation of Shabbat, such that he would get karet or karet if done without witnesses, or a korban if done by mistake, korban hatat. B'mai, what act is he talking about? Ibishchita, shechita bezar keshera. If he's talking about doing shechita on the animal, actually a non-Kohen is allowed to do shechita. So that would not be a case where he would be liable on 2 counts because azad is permitted. So that can't be it. If you're talking about receiving the blood in the vessel and bringing it, so in that case he would be liable as a non-Kohen. A Kohen has to do that, but that's not a Isur Shabbat. What is he doing? He's just moving something. It's not in Reshut Harabim. So that also there only 1 would apply. If it's about the burning, that he's putting these things on the altar and burning them, well, according to the Bioseh, and this is all according to the Bioseh, he's the one that says liable to 2 counts. He also happens to be the one that says that if one kindles a fire on Shabbat, that, even though it's one of the 39 melachot, that one is singled out to say that would not be liable as for a death penalty, or a sin offering like the others. The reason is because the Torah goes out of its way to say lo tevaru esh b'chol moshevotechem. We already know you can't do melacha, and this is one of the melachot. Why does the Torah have to single out that one? Rabbi Yosef says to say it's only a lav, a lesser prohibition, and it is not liable to karet, death penalty, or a sin offering. Okay, so then also in that case you would not be liable to two. So we can't find any actual avodah, that any act that would make this non-kohen liable on both acting as a zad and violating Shabbat. Okay, so we're going to have a couple of answers. Amar Rab Acha bar Yaakov b'shchitat paro shel kohen gadol. Oh, the kohen gadol has to bring a par on Yom Kippur. And we're talking about that. That one, even though in general a non-Kohen can do shechita, there is an opinion that says the par of the Kohen Gadol has to be done by the Kohen Gadol and no one else. So that must be talking about that. Wait a second. Wait, in that case, you don't have to talk about a non-Kohen. Even a regular Kohen would be prohibited from doing shechita on that, because it has to be the Kohen Gadol himself. He says, you're right. Shezad etzlo kamar. When we say zad here in this case, it doesn't mean only a non-Kohen. Even a non-Kohen Gadol would violate if performing this, and that is the one case we can find where someone who is not authorized, and the non-Kohen Gadol, if he did it, would violate two things, as not authorized, not Kohen Gadol, and then violating Shabbat. Okay, and last, Matkif la Rav Asher, midi hataot katane. And Rav Asher says, hold on, what's your whole problem? Did we ever say that, did Rabbi Yosef in the first place say that he's liable for two sin offerings? Or laveketane, did he say one is liable for two lavim? He didn't say that. Ela isure be'alma kachashiv. He just said one is liable on two counts, right? Whatever it is, doesn't matter if there's a practical effect in the actual punishment. And so there's no practical effect here when he's alive. There's no additional prohibition. All right, Rabbi Yosef still said he's liable on two counts, and the only practical effect it would be when the person died. We had to decide where in the cemetery he will be buried. There's one section for people that violate only one thing, and there's another section for people even worse who violate two things, and so he'll be in the worse section. But you don't necessarily have to find an actual practical difference where he would be liable for two sin offerings. So therefore, it could be talking about any of these acts that one does. Even a regular Kohen. Even a non-Kohen does in the Bet HaMikdash as he performs them on Shabbat. And so here, as we end this sugya, we end on the same note as we did the previous stuff with the statement of it makes a difference only in the cemetery. We now begin the next Mishnah, which involves a problematic case of wife swapping, and was going to count just how many prohibitions they would be liable to for doing that. Okay, Shenayim shekiddishu shete nashim. Two men did kiddushin, each with their future wives. And kiddushin is actually more than just being engaged. At the point of kiddushin, if one of them would commit adultery, it is already adultery. They are mikudashot to their husbands. And so they did kiddushin, and then they're having a wedding. They're doing nisuin. B'shat knisatan nechupa hechelifu et zeh shel zeh when they come to consummate their marriage, each of the grooms takes the wrong bride. They are all going to be liable for adultery, right? Man A took woman B, so he is liable for taking someone else's wife. She is liable for being with another man, and the other way around. All four are liable to eshet ish. V'im achin, let's say the two grooms are brothers, mishum eshet ach, then each of them took their brother's wife. And so that is another problem of edva, that all four violate. Vim hayu achayot mishum isha el achota. And let's say the two brides are sisters. This is why it's related to the case above. If the two brides are sisters, then each of the men is taking his wife's sister, and all four are liable on that count as well. And to throw in for good measure, ivim hayu nidot mishum nida, if they are, the women were in a state of nida, then all of them would also be liable for sleeping with a nida. All right, so now what do we do if such a thing happened? What's the next step? So they have to separate from all intimacy for 3 months, just in case they got pregnant from that interaction. And you want to know, if they did get interaction, you want to know who the father is. If they go back to their original husbands the next day, then and they get pregnant, we won't know, is it mamzer or from the wrong husband, or is it okay? So we separate for 3 months, and then they can go back. Right? They sinned, but they are still in mikudashot to the original husband, so they should go back and finish off the proper nisuin to the proper person. And let's say they were minors and they could not become pregnant yet before puberty. Then they can go back to their respective proper husbands immediately, because we're not worried that they became pregnant. And if these wives were married to kohanim, then being married to kohanim, they can eat terumah. Even if they were born from their father was Yisrael. But now, because they were intimate they committed adultery, and so anyone who commits adultery is also a zonah, prohibited to a kohen. And so what it doesn't say here, but is also true, is that they would be prohibited to go back, right? If the men were kohanim, then the woman would be prohibited to go back to the Kohanim. All right, interesting cases. And now the Gemara is going to ask, Hechelifu, did they do this on purpose? Are we talking about evildoers who are performing wife swapping on purpose? Is that the case? Right? We don't usually like to bring up cases about people who are perpetrating such evil. Regarding this Mishnah, Rabbi Chiya had a braita that said we have 16 sin offerings altogether. There's 4 people, each of whom violated 4 prohibitions, right? The ones that we listed. And so 16 altogether. Now, if they did this on purpose, then you don't bring a sin offering. For a sin offering is only when it's done by mistake, right? That night, they had a wedding together, and somehow when they went to their rooms, they went to the wrong ones, right? It's happened before in Sefer Bereshit, so it could happen. So if it happened by mistake, then it would make sense that they have to bring sin offerings. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. Amar Rav Yehuda Taneh Huchlefu. So Rav Yehuda says, no, you should read not Hechelifu, that they did it on purpose, but rather they were switched, right? There was just a mix-up in the hotel room number, and such a thing happened. It was not their fault, and therefore we're not talking about Rishaim, and that's why there is sin offerings. Good. And in fact, we can prove that this has to be the case. Dekatani sefa im hayu ketanot she'enan re'uyot leled machazir noto miyad. We said that if they were, if the brides were minors, then they don't have to wait, because we know for sure they're not pregnant, and they can go to their proper husbands immediately. But if they sinned on purpose, can you go back to your husband? Halacha is, if a woman commits adultery, consensual adultery, then she's prohibited to her husband. So then they wouldn't be able to go back. No, this would not be a problem to explain, because pitui ketana ones ninhu ve'ones b'Yisrael mishra shareh. No, a case when a minor girl is seduced, then that's considered rape. In other words, there is no such thing as consensual sex for a minor. If an adult either forces himself on a minor or is able to convince her to agree. That agreement is not an agreement. A minor is not does not have the mind set to be able to agree to such a thing, and therefore that's even pitui ketana is considered as if she was forced. And anytime you have a married woman who is raped against her will, then she is allowed to go to her husband if it's Israel. Not for a Kohen would be a problem. So the ketana case is not a problem, right? No matter what, whatever her mindset was, makes no difference. She's a minor, so it was always considered rape, and she can go back to her husband. And so it really wouldn't matter. This by itself cannot prove that it's a case of mistake and not purposeful. Ela dekatani mafrishin otan shelosha chodashim shema me'ubadot hen ha lav me'ubadot sharian v'bemezid mi shareh ela lav shema'mina huchlefu shema'mina. But rather, there is a good proof from the case of adults, where if the women were adults and then we have to separate them for 3 months because we're afraid maybe they got pregnant from the wrong husband and the children are mamzerin, but the implication is that if they are not pregnant, they are permitted to go back to their husbands. Now, if they did the swapping knowingly and willingly, then they would not be able to go back to their husbands. That would be consensual knowing adultery and prohibited. So from the fact that the Mishnah says they can go back to their husbands after 3 months, even though they're adults, means that it must be there was a mistake. It was shogeg. They didn't realize huchlefu. They were switched, not that they switched on purpose. Shema mina, and so that is the final conclusion. And so luckily we are not dealing with Reshaim, just a really unfortunate mix-up. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.